Welcome everyone to our next episode of Presenting Our Presence, or commonly called POP. Today we have the honor and the pleasure of meeting with Pamela McCoy Jones. Our co-hosts today are myself, Florence Glanfield, and our colleagues Cindy Gaudet and Kyle Napier. Presenting Our Presence is a monthly podcast released at the full moon of each month that amplifies the voices of Indigenous peoples that work at the University of Alberta. And Pamela is the Executive Director for the Supporting Indigenous Languages Revitalization Project. So Pamela, welcome to Presenting Our Presence. Thank you for joining us today. And please introduce yourself in the way that you would like the audience to know about you. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. And thank you, Cindy and Kyle, for welcoming onto the podcast. My name is Pamela McCoy Jones. I am Anishinaabe. I'm originally from Ontario. My mother is from Mishpachautin First Nation, and my dad is registered with Batchewana First Nation. I moved out west when I was quite young. I was about 5 years old, and we moved out west and moved around a little bit and kind of settled in. I grew up in Spruce Grove. So I currently reside in Parkland County and have spent time my younger years in Edmonton and area. And I have a family of 4, which is really important to me to mention that. And I've been with my husband for over 20 years. So that's a little bit about me. And I have worked at the University of Alberta for not quite 2 years, and it's gone by quite fast. I think I've kind of been on this trajectory of a very steep learning curve as Executive Director and working in Indigenous language revitalization. But that's a little bit about me.
Well, Pamela, thank you so much. And I know that you had offered a topic that you really wanted to discuss through Presenting Our Presence around the role of Indigenous women in leadership. What an exciting opportunity to hear your perspectives and given the experiences that you've had. So I invite you to pick up and start sharing. How are you thinking about Indigenous women in leadership?
Well, I kind of go back, I guess, starting in, when I first started at the university. So I'm an alumni. I'm a U of A graduate of the Faculty of Native Studies, and then continued on and did my master's in public administration at U of Vic. But when I first arrived at the university, I think I was just so taken back with, some of those women in leadership roles. Who quickly became role models. And one person in particular was Dr. Jane Martin, who I went on to work for in government for a number of years. I worked in Alberta education in the policy area, and also came in contact at that point as a recent grad with Evelyn Goodstriker and was Donna Crowshoe. And these were kind of women that were in these leadership roles and had this higher education, which, for myself, I was at the time one of the first people in my family to graduate from university. And then seeing these women in leadership roles and really kind of taking up this space in boardrooms. And it was just something that really kind of stuck with me as like, wow, I can't believe I'm in this space. And moving on and going at the time, there was a lot we saw men in leadership roles. And so over the years, there's transition of more women in leadership roles and more women taking up those spaces. So as I kind of, built my family and moved along and kept exploring the policy areas and that curiosity about why things are the way they are. And I really enjoyed research, really looking at those policy and legislative implications of, I guess, oppression of Indigenous peoples across Canada, in other countries. And so I furthered my studies in public administration, which, I I really appreciated, I think, the rigor and some of those complexities of study, and then being able to find myself working as a consultant while I had young children, and then coming back into a full-time role such as this one. So, I'm looking around and seeing the university and how there are shifts and changes, such as the Office of the Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research, such as all of these different supports for Indigenous students across the board. I'm learning so much about, the recruitment of Indigenous students and those supports that are there. There were supports, I believe, for myself, but it's blown up, I believe, since I was at the University of Alberta as a student. And so coming in to be able to participate and look at this work and seeing women in these leadership roles and how that work is taken up a little bit differently. And I find that with working in language revitalization, that this is, a lot of hard work that we often don't leave our positions, and check out. I find myself, thinking and strategizing about different ways that we can make progress and make change, and then talking and I find myself surrounded with similar, other women in academia that are navigating the same situations and navigating their roles and being able to collaborate and learn from each other. And I just think it's such a beautiful piece. And and learning different strategies and sharing those experiences has just been so rewarding and helpful, so that we're not in it on our own. We have this kind of network and collaborators that we can kind of lean on a little bit and learn from. So that's something I think I'll continue to explore, and looking at that a little bit further.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela. And can you tell me a little bit more, or elaborate a bit? Like, you mentioned some of those early mentors for you. And what did you notice that those incredible Indigenous women were, how, and I'm for the lack of a better word, did they navigate spaces differently? Did they, like you were observing as you were first interacting with them? Can you give us some insight in what you noticed?
Well, I think it was just the one piece that I noticed is that these women were first and foremost, very humble and very grounded in who they were and why they were there, and that commitment to education, and specifically Indigenous education. So there were no airs of that, they were in this high position and above anybody else. It was like I felt like an equal, even though I was a new graduate. I was in my my mid-20s at the time, and so it was really about mentoring and sharing information and not withholding information. It was just very open, honest communication of sharing. So that's something I think is really important, because we're often put in situations, I think, of having different hierarchies, and that some people may not fit, but we're creating these spaces and safe spaces to be able to work together, share your thoughts without judgment or nervousness. So putting all those kind of things aside and just having an open, honest conversations was something that I think I've learned, and hopefully taken on into my roles in how I've grown.
Yeah, those are really powerful images that you've just shared, right? About thinking about how structure exists within organizations. And so as you think about this now in relation to, I'm going to say in relationship, you talked about to your children and to your family. How do you think some of these teachings are also helping you frame the conversations you have with youth that are in your life?
Yeah, I think once you have kids, I have 4 amazing children, and as they've kind of grown up, and just realizing that I guess a responsibility to try to make change, to try to make improvements. Systemic racism exists. There's all the work that needs to be done, and I kind of focus I focused a long time on my children in particular. But, as I think I've matured and got more experiences thinking beyond ourselves, beyond, that acquisition of title and getting ahead in your success, and kind of just realizing like, I just want to do this just for betterment, beyond myself, beyond those sorts of things. And so I think that goes back again to that heart work of, it's the work is beyond ourselves, and maybe also not being so hard on ourselves too. Like, we can only do so much, right? And hopefully we do enough to make an impact to see those ripple effects in future generations. For all Indigenous people, we have, a lot of pieces that we think about equity. Indigenous people, I mean, the word itself is, all inclusive of many different nations, many different experiences of Indigenous people across Canada, and especially, within the university, we have a number of different students and representation in the academia, coming from all different nations, languages, dialects, all of those pieces. I try to keep up the forefront of my work and my understanding, because we don't know everything, but we have to be, respectful of those other nations, those other languages, those other, multiple ways of knowing and being. I think if you kind of keep that at the forefront and proceed in a good way, then, hopefully we're making an impact on the work that we're doing.
I guess just to kind of pick up that thread in terms of leadership, and I'm so grateful that you brought that to our podcast, because I think about leadership more so than I think I had before in the past. And when you spoke about kind of what stands out, what's different in terms of your role models, and as I was mentioning to you recently, it's like there's only one book called Indigenous Women's Leadership, right? There's so little literature out there. But when I think about the women I grew up with, I'm like, wow, these women were leaders. And I don't think I would have ever thought of my mère as a leader, or my aunties as these community leaders, that we've always been leaders. Like, we come from women that were leaders. As if we can look far back, into the times of what was happening yesterday. I just spoke about what was happening in 1885 and how these women were engaged as leaders, right? And how we forget that, I forget, or I don't think about them as leaders, because I think about them, oh, that's my mom, that's my grandmothers, that's my aunties. And so I just love that you're bringing forward that kind of new thinking to actually the way in which we lead. What are those differences, right? And there's a beautiful piece called that Sylvia Miracle and Dr. Kim Anderson have written, and it's about her perspective on leadership. And she says, we carry the bones of our people in the way in which we lead. And so with that, I think I'm thinking more deeply about what that means. And you're certainly speaking to that. It's like we bring those ethics in that mentoring. We bring those ethics in terms of looking after one another, in checking in with one another, uplifting one another, like those ancestral women, like our grandmothers did. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Right? And so I think about these generations of leaders that have inspired us, or the ones we are meeting today. And what a game changer when we have Indigenous women at the table in these institutions. Like, it is so powerful. And I agree. It's like, wow, we are in a really exquisite new time, and the power of coming together, like you said, like this network of women leading together. Right? I think that's also the difference, and it interrupts this notion. I often think about, and I love your thoughts on this also, is there's this myth that as a woman, you either have to be a mother, you have to stay at home, be a mother, or you can be a leader, you can't have children, community, family. And here you are, you're a mother of 4 leading this initiative at the University of Alberta. And so there's something, and I haven't explored it further, but there's something around this idea that gets this narrative of you can't have it all or you can have it all. And but when we think about leadership like you're talking about, it's a whole other way of imagining and living a leadership.
Mhm. And I appreciate that too. And I think too that we, in my coming, working at the university and working as within our advisory council for supporting Indigenous languages has a beautiful advisory council with elders and language knowledge holders and traditional gifted people that most of them are actually women. We have a couple men, but what I've learned is that the learnings that and the teachings that they have, and again that humbleness and being able to manage all of those different things and still staying true to their passion of the importance of language and the importance of the work that they're doing, managing it with grace and managing it with that humbleness is so important. And we just recently had a panel, and Doreen Daychief was on that panel, and just the way that she is able to again hold space and be able to share, her teachings, and being able to, just open up herself to that is just a beautiful way that she's leading that work at a very I don't know if you say grassroots. I could think of a different word than grassroots for that, but and so being exposed to that and seeing the women in communities leading revitalization work, and men, but in particularly because I see that I relate and look up to them so much for the work that they're doing and managing those pieces. And so also realizing that they need help. They need help in that work, and that it's not easy work to mobilize language revitalization efforts in community, and it's exhausting. I don't think there's like a I hit the button and now I'm retired when you get to like an elder and a knowledge holder, because there's just so much urgency in that the work that communities are doing in language. And that's one of those pieces that really drew me to this work, the project, the SILR project supporting Indigenous language revitalization, is that recognition of communities have done so much and advocated for so many years, and then we're coming in and just supporting that work in any way that's respectful and mindful of those pieces. So yeah, it's great. And I think those wellness pieces, wellness does come back into that leadership and how we manage our wellness and well-being. And there is that understanding too, that there is a lot of healing that needs to happen. And those aspects are important as well to that always come into the conversation. Any conversation, whether it's, education and language revitalization, economic, across the board, that holistic kind of piece of how we manage our well-being to be able to be successful in any other area that we're going to be, excelling in.
Is it okay for me to jump in here?
Yes, jump in.
So, Pamela, I so appreciate the opportunity to share in conversation with you again. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and your involvement, your passions behind supporting Indigenous language revitalization, and just picking up on that thread of healing and wellness and safety, and tying that to language revitalization, is that there's a generation of silent speakers who have the language within them, but there's that hesitancy to bring it out, and those are the ingredients that are needed to support the environments that make people feel more comfortable. But often there's a lot of tears and trauma and hurt and shame that needs to that needs to be worked through, and it needs to be worked through in a place, in an environment that where people feel okay to make mistakes, to be themselves, to just release that. And something I've heard is that there's an indicator for language health related to the number of young men who are fluent, and the reason why it's the number of young men is because the responsibility for intergenerational language and cultural transmission so often falls on women, and there's this patriarchal paradox of cultural transmission, where that's an indicator because of that responsibility that so often falls on women. I mean, like, very much as you know, in spaces of language and culture, looking around, I mean, there are very rarely men in those environments. And so I wanted to ask you about what's involved in those matriarchal virtues of communication and discourse that support, like you said, the holism of education and language, to support healing, wellness, and safety, where it's not as available in those patriarchal environments.
Yeah, and I think the programming, the design of the work that we're doing with SILR has a balance of, yes, we want to, we want to train linguists, Indigenous community linguists is really important, but we also recognize that, there's work to be done with youth and young adults, and how those pieces. So we're building capacity not only within the university structure itself, with it obviously Western institution, colonial institution, but we're also reaching out to community, and many communities are, looking for supports or, to do that healing, and that is, largely land-based learning. That's, learning experiential learning on in community. So it's that balance of, healing and wellness, to be well enough to learn your language, or to be to have the space to be like, oh, I'm interested in perhaps learning the language, and then moving in kind of this trajectory of the language journey is very different for very different, demographics, young adults, someone that's wanting to be a teacher, a language teacher, and then elders as well, right? I've heard elders say, they miss speaking the language with other language speakers. They have less and less people to be able to have a fluent conversation only in their language. I've heard a dear elder kind of say, I love speaking Cree. I love speaking Cree, and you having those environments to be able to do those pieces. So there is that balance of, that continuum of there's so many needs of different age groups, different genders. We do have programming for young Indigenous women specifically, building that identity piece comes in into the conversation, of course. Young adults, having opportunity to learn, and the language acquisition. So yeah, I don't know if I actually answered your question, but I'm just saying that there is a diversity, and that there's no one size fits all in this work, in this arena of language revitalization, which I appreciate, and also see the challenges that we're up against, because we can't do everything, but we can support that work that's being done.
Yeah, and Pamela, as you were talking, and Kyle, as your question, I mean, I think about one of the members of our advisory council, and in conversations that I've had with him, and this is Elder Dr. Elmer Ghostekeeper. Elmer actually talks about the first language teacher as being the woman that gave birth to you. And that there is this connection, and they are teaching you as they hold you, and as they actually carry you. So it's very interesting to think about that in terms of the role of women in language, and teaching, I guess. And I don't understand it all, but as you were asked the question and as Pamela responded, maybe, yeah, this is what I continue to think about. Because, of course, what happens if, as we hear language, we hear it from our mothers or the women who raise us first. So it's interesting to think about that in relation to language revitalization.
And I also would bring in, to add to that, Florence, is just you reminded me about, the men that are often leading ceremony. We, oftentimes that there are men, the language speakers, and there is that understanding of how closely tied language is to ceremony, and that the two are interconnected. And so I think there definitely is a role and a focus on that is also that the ceremonial families and the ceremonial learnings and teachings that are so intrinsic to language revitalization as well. So yeah, that was just that's a really good observation.
Yeah, and thank you for that reminder, Pamela, because that's absolutely, like, I think about a friend of mine who, was studying language and working closely with a language holder, and ceremony. So it's all interwoven, right? And then at some point, the elder said to my friend, well, I can't teach you anymore until you spend more time with the language, right? There's this such a connectedness to ceremony, language, land. Yeah. So it's a really like, how do we think about language? How do we think about the concept of acquisition and learning? Like, and is it, and I think about, all of those things as you, every time we meet with our advisory council around this work and when we talk with community members, and just, yeah.
And the spirit of the language, and that's often a term that is used, and that this, there's a deeper connection for Indigenous people across Canada, across the world, with the language and that connection to the land. And so how do you explain that, and how do you sum that up? It's I think it's a beautiful, complex area of study, and to be able to meet all of these different people with different perspectives is I'm just so grateful for that, because I'm just this a new learner, and so many of us, going back to that which Kyle mentioned, is the language that was stolen and the language that was lost through the residential schools. My grandparents attended residential school, and in our family, I could say the language was in fact lost at that time. And so people are living with this, but and then looking back and kind of you're just trying to make do day to day, and so many people will say, in the baby boomer kind of age, I guess, would say, I feel so bad that I didn't share the language. I feel so bad that I didn't teach my children. I hear that quite often. And but then going back to that understanding of policy and practice and legislation, that there was, systematic ways that, the language was stolen from nations across the world. So it's like this revitalization is also a challenging word, and what that means, and how we are revitalizing the language and those connections. And it varies, and it's beautiful and vast across the world. So I was able to attend a conference in Australia, and there was just so many similarities with the language. And we had a guest visit from South Africa, and she would say our tongues were cut, our tongues, very, very visual, and it was something that just kind of stuck with me about that, violent act of language loss. and what we have to do. So I'm, know that the challenge is great, and know that, our work and the project that I'm working on is just, making hopefully a foundation, for future work. But, we can't put necessarily a time or an amount of money on language revitalization because, it was so systematically taken away from us.
I think your last words are just so powerful and is such a beautiful way to leave this, leave us with all thinking about how is it that we live and respect languages and the process of revitalizing. And it's not a noun of revitalization, but it's revitalizing, if that makes sense. There may be no word like that. Pamela, we are so grateful for the wisdom that you've shared with us today, for being on Presenting Our Presence, to helping amplify the Indigenous brilliance that is at the University of Alberta. So thank you to everybody, to Kyle, Cindy. Once again, an amazing conversation.
Chairs, blankets, pillows, and tea, like we're visiting over tea.